Deep in the Taklamakan Desert of western China, archaeologists pulled something impossible from the sand. Bodies that shouldn't exist. Tall frames with red and blonde hair, deep-set eyes and tattooed skin, wrapped in plaid wool tartan and buried inside boat-shaped coffins thousands of miles from any ocean. Some wore cone-shaped hats over 2 feet high. One woman had cheese placed on her chest. A man went to his grave in woven trousers that belonged in Bronze Age Scotland, not ancient China. They looked European, but they died here 4,000 years ago, perfectly preserved in one of the most hostile landscapes on Earth. For decades, nobody could agree on who these people were or where they came from. Were they lost Celtic wanderers, proto-Viking nomads, the ancestors of a mysterious extinct civilization? Scholars argued, governments intervened, and the mystery only deepened. Then came the DNA. And the answer was stranger than anyone had predicted. These people were not Europeans who traveled east. They were something far older than Europe itself. The first reports came from European explorers in the early 20th century. Sven Hedin, Aurel Stein, and others crossing the Silk Road brought back accounts of desiccated human remains eroding out of the desert sand. Most dismissed these as curiosities. Systematic investigation would have to wait. In 1979, Chinese archaeologists excavating at Gumugu near the dried-up Lop Nur Lake uncovered 42 ancient graves. The earliest of these dated to somewhere between 2135 BCE and 1939 BCE. The bodies were tall, their hair was light, their features were unmistakably Western. Nobody quite knew what to make of them. Then, in 1980, a film crew working on a Silk Road documentary stumbled upon something even more striking. Near the ancient oasis city of Lulin, they found a woman who had been dead for 3,800 years, yet looked almost alive. Auburn hair, delicate eyelashes, still intact. She was wrapped in a woolen cloak, wearing a fur hat and leather boots. Archaeologists named her the Beauty of Lulin. More followed. Churchin Man, buried around 1000 BCE, stood nearly 6 feet tall with red hair and a tartan plaid wool tunic. He was interred alongside 2 women and an infant son, the baby wrapped in burgundy wool with a tiny blue felt cap, stones placed carefully over his eyes. Further east, the witches of Subeshi were buried wearing tall black conical hats over 2 feet high, a style that looked startling to modern eyes, but was standard headgear among Saka Scythian nomads. Then came the most dramatic find of all. In 1934, Swedish explorer Folke Bergman had briefly surveyed a remote cemetery deep in the desert before its location was lost for decades. In 2000, a team using satellite data relocated it. Excavations from 2002 onward uncovered the Yweohe necropolis, around 330 tombs dating from 2000 to 1450 BCE. The dead lay inside wooden coffins carved to resemble boats, sealed with cowhide with long wooden oars thrust vertically into the sand above them. One woman found here, the Beauty of Xiaohe, appeared so lifelike that excavators described her as smiling softly in her sleep. Unlike Egyptian mummies prepared through deliberate embalming, these bodies were preserved entirely by nature. Extreme dryness, salt-rich soil, and sub-zero winters had done the work. The desert had kept them almost perfectly intact for 4,000 years, waiting. The bodies themselves were remarkable. What they were buried with was equally so. Churchin Man's tartan plaid leggings were not some crude primitive weaving. Textile expert Elizabeth Barber examined the fabric and found the twill weave and plaid pattern virtually identical to fabric scraps recovered from the Hallstatt-era salt mines in Austria, dated to around 1200 BCE. She called it the easternmost known example of this tradition. His wife was buried in a red wool robe so finely woven and richly dyed that researchers struggle to explain how this level of textile technology existed here, at this time, this far from anything. The food in the graves told an equally strange story. Wheat and barley, crops originally domesticated in the Near East. Millet, which is East Asian. Animal bones and dairy products from both cattle and goats. This was already a cultural crossroads long before anyone had drawn a map of one. Most striking was a white substance found placed directly on several mummies' chests. DNA analysis confirmed it as cheese, fermented from cow and goat milk, making it the oldest known cheese ever discovered at around 3,600 years old. Milk peptides found in the mummies' dental plaque confirm they consumed dairy regularly throughout their lives. Ephedra twigs were found tucked into burials across multiple sites. This is the same plant believed to be the basis of soma in Vedic Indian religion and hyoma in ancient Iranian practice. Its presence here suggests a shared ritual tradition reaching across the steppe. The burial customs themselves raised further questions. These people were interred in boat-shaped coffins in one of the most waterless places on Earth. The boat as a vessel for the afterlife journey appears in Norse tradition, ancient Egypt, and Bronze Age Europe. Its presence deep in the Taklamakan Desert suggests either a distant cultural connection or a shared mythological framework so ancient it predates any of those civilizations individually. Female mummies were found with elaborate tattoos, moons on eyelids, decorative scrolls running along the fingers, oval markings on the forehead. Identical tattooing traditions have been documented among Scythian peoples to the north at roughly the same period. Some women's graves also contained wooden objects, hollowed out, painted red on the inside, stuffed with feathers and lizard bones. Their function was ritual. Their symbolism echoes both the Shiva lingam of Indian religious tradition and descriptions in Icelandic sagas of preserved horse parts kept by Viking women for ceremonial purposes. What emerges is a portrait of a frontier society that was geographically isolated but culturally entangled with half the ancient world. The mummies were puzzling enough on their own. Then medieval Chinese manuscripts introduced an entirely new layer of mystery. In 1907, scholars identified a previously unknown language hidden inside manuscripts recovered from the Tarim Basin. They called it Tocharian. Written records dated from roughly the 4th to the 13th centuries AD, and the language came in two distinct varieties, Tocharian A and Tocharian B, which had diverged from a common ancestor somewhere between 600 and 100 BCE. What stunned linguists was where Tocharian sat on the Indo-European family tree. It belonged to the centum branch, the same broad grouping as Celtic, Greek, and Latin, not the Eastern Iranian or Sanskrit branch you might expect from a language found in Western China. Phylogenetic analysis suggested Tocharian had split from Proto-Indo-European nearly 8,000 years ago, making it one of the earliest departures from the parent language. Wall paintings from the Cave of the 16 Swordbearers, dated between 432 and 538 AD, show Tocharian princes with distinctly European coloring. Contemporary Chinese sources describe the Western peoples of this region with deep-set eyes, red beards, pink skin, and blue-green eyes. The natural conclusion seemed obvious. The mummies and the Tocharians must be the same people. But then the DNA arrived and dismantled that assumption entirely. For years, the leading theory was that the Tarim mummies were migrants from the Afanasyevo culture of southern Siberia. These were an early offshoot of the Yamnaya steppe nomads, known to have Caucasoid features and cattle-herding economies, and their burial styles bore enough resemblance to the Tarim mummies to make the connection seem plausible. Others argued for origins in the BMAC, the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex of Central Asia or even the Indus Valley. The debate ran for decades, fueled mostly by how the mummies looked and what they were buried with. In 2021, an international research team published a landmark study in Nature. They had extracted genome-wide DNA from 13 of the oldest Tarim Basin mummies, those dated between 2100 BC and 1700 BC. The results overturned everything. There was no Afanasyevo ancestry, no BMAC signal, no trace of any recently arrived outside group. Instead, the Tarim mummies carried almost entirely Ancient North Eurasian ancestry, a lineage belonging to Ice Age hunter-gatherers who had populated Siberia and Central Asia more than 10,000 years earlier. This population had largely disappeared from the modern world, surviving only in tiny genetic fractions in present-day Siberians and Native Americans. The Tarim people were not migrants. They were a genetic isolate, a pocket of Ice Age humanity that had somehow survived intact into the Bronze Age while the rest of Eurasia transformed around them. This reframed everything about how they acquired their sophisticated culture. They had adopted farming techniques, dairying, and textile traditions through contact with neighboring peoples, not through intermarriage with them. Ideas had crossed the boundaries. Genes had not. It is the same pattern seen later when Arabic spread across Turkey, Iran, and Egypt without replacing the underlying genetics of those populations. To the north, in the Tocharian Basin, a separate group of Bronze Age mummies did carry Afanasyevo and Yamnaya ancestry, confirming that steppe nomads had reached the edges of Xinjiang by 3000 BC. But these were a distinct population from the Tarim founders. By the Iron Age, the picture changed. Later cemeteries show clear genetic mixing, with Scythian, East Asian, and Central Asian ancestries all appearing alongside the original ANE lineage. The isolation had finally broken down. The most important reframe of all concerns what these people actually look like and why. Their Western appearance was not evidence of European origin. Ancient North Eurasian ancestry is the deep shared source of physical features we now associate with Europeans. The Tarim people did not travel west to east. They represented something older than that distinction ever existed. As for the Tocharian language, current evidence points to it arriving via Afanasyevo descended peoples from the northern Tocharian Basin during the Late Bronze Age, not from the original ANE founders of the Tarim itself. The science was complicated enough. The politics made everything harder. The mummies were found in Xinjiang, home of the Uyghur people, a Turkic-speaking Muslim minority with a long and turbulent history of tension with the Chinese government. When the Lulan beauty was discovered in the late 1970s, some Uyghur activists claimed her as an ancient ancestor. The logic was straightforward. If Caucasian mummies predated any Han Chinese presence in the region, that ancient priority could support arguments for Uyghur claims to the land they call East Turkestan. Chinese authorities were alarmed. For years, foreign scientists found it nearly impossible to obtain DNA samples or publish findings without permission being quietly denied. Victor Mayer, the American archaeologist who had done more than almost anyone to bring the mummies to international attention, complained openly in 2008 that serious scientific research on the mummies was simply not happening. The tension came to a head in 2010 when a U.S. museum tour featuring the mummies was abruptly interrupted. Chinese authorities pulled the artifacts before their Philadelphia showing, officially citing exhibit duration regulations. Few observers believed that explanation. China's eventual response was to commission sweeping genetic research on its own terms. The 2022 study, analyzing 201 ancient genomes from Xinjiang, was presented domestically as proof that the region had always been a melting pot belonging to no single ethnic group, which scientifically is actually accurate. But the timing and framing made the political motivation difficult to ignore. The deeper irony is that the DNA evidence, undermines every nationalist claim simultaneously. The Tarim mummies were neither European nor Chinese in origin. They were older than both. So who were they really? Not Vikings, not Celts, not a lost European tribe that somehow wandered into the Chinese desert. The Tarim mummies were the last survivors of an Ice Age lineage that had endured quietly in Central Asia for millennia, while the world around them was remade again and again by migration, conquest, and cultural upheaval. Their story rewrites the prehistory of the Silk Road. Cultural exchange was already happening thousands of years before silk, before Roman traders, before any of the civilizations we associate with that route. It was carried not by armies, but by ideas, seeds, and textile patterns, passing between isolated communities across vast distances. And perhaps most importantly, their story proves that the spread of culture never required the replacement of people. The Tarim mummies absorbed innovations from every direction while remaining genetically themselves for centuries. The desert preserved their bodies for 4,000 years. DNA finally gave them back their story.